Okay, good afternoon. Want to thank Sagia for giving us this opportunity to spend some time with you this afternoon. The session today, we will talk to you a little bit about the concept of entrepreneurial thought and action, a philosophy that we at Babson College strongly believe in, and we'll give you a little bit of background on what it is about, how we approach it. Some of the themes that we will touch upon are themes that you have heard at this conference, the debate over nurture versus nature, whether entrepreneurs are born, whether entrepreneurs can be made, whether you find opportunities, whether you shape opportunities. So we'll have a chance to revisit some of those themes again. And we'll give you a little bit of the academic background to where some of these ideas are coming from. But before I get into the formal presentation, I'd like to start with a little story, and I'd like for you folks to think about the moral of the story. So I'm going to have, we have people with mics around at this point, so we can do the mics. But so here's the way the story goes. There are three people who get shipwrecked on this deserted island. And there's nothing there, and they're looking for survival, and they find a can of food. And so they said, "Oh wow, and we've got some food." There's this jar of food, but they don't have a can opener. So the first person, who happens to be an economist by training, says, "Well, solution is simple. Let's just assume we have a can opener." And he's done. Well, the second person, who by training is a theoretical physicist, goes to make some calculations, and he says, this is the mass, this is the volume of this jar. If you apply so many pounds per square inch of pressure at the right point, the top of the can will pop up. All right? And the third person, who by training is an engineer, takes the can and throws it hard against a tree and see if it breaks open or not. So what I want to ask you is, what do you get out of the three ways in which these people have approached this problem of opening the can? So anybody, any volunteers? Yes, the gentleman up here in the front. Can we get the mic over, please? A mic over here, please. Thank you. Right here in this table up here. Thank you.
I think it's about your past experience, the discipline, the your education, your background, all those affect the way you see things.
Right. So the first person, our economist, what did he do with this problem? How did he approach it? Sort of assumed it away.
Yeah, I mean he just took the assumption actually.
And then that's assumed away the problem. Problem didn't exist. Actually, yes. Problem didn't exist for him because he just assumed away that he had a can opener, right?
Yes.
And what did our second person do?
He was the analytical person.
The theoretical physicist, right?
Yes, exactly.
Analyzed the problem in great depth, came up with a marvelous solution, got the calculations done. But did it open the can?
No. Not.
Now, what did the engineer do?
Experience it.
Yeah, just found a workable solution. Just acted, didn't he?
He did, actually.
Right.
He took an action.
So you notice that people engage with the world in different ways, and each of the disciplines tends to train us in a particular mode of thought and a particular mode of acting. And so if you see the title, Entrepreneurial Thought and Action, what we're trying to get across is there is a modality of thinking by which people engage in the world, and that modality of thinking leads them to behave in different ways. And if you all notice, most of us who have gone to college and have been trained in, whether we have been trained in social sciences or natural sciences, we have all been trained in what is called the scientific method. And so what we are told is, if you have a problem, you need to define the problem, generate a working hypothesis about the solution, collect the data, analyze the data, and then decide whether the hypothesis that you had is true or false, and that's how you learn. And that's the way we tend to approach problems. That is what we have been taught to do. There is, however, an alternative way in which people have been approaching the world. And in particular, this alternative mode of thinking is very, very prevalent in what we call serial entrepreneurs. So if you look at the behavior, not the stories, but the behavior of serial entrepreneurs, you find that they have a slightly distinctive and different way of thinking about the world and a slightly different way of engaging the world, okay? So just for those of you who are academically inclined, the source of a lot of this thinking from the academic perspective comes from a body of literature that comes from as diverse a field as economics and sociology and psychology. And basically, this literature that you're seeing that has developed over the years talks about how people approach an uncertain world. And the classical, neoclassical economic theory has always been built around the rational profit-maximizing firm and the rational consumer who computes the utility of how much he's going to consume and how they're going to spend their money. And as opposed to that, that emerged in economics back in the 1960s, a body of literature that said, you know, stop theorizing about how consumers behave, stop theorizing about how business firms behave, and take an actual look at their behavior. And we discovered that this marvelous individual, the irrational economic person that we thought had all of this ability to do massive calculations, couldn't even remember more than 7 digits at a time. So if you throw random numbers at people, psychology experiments show you that the best they can remember are 7 of those numbers. So with that kind of limited cognitive capacity, how do you expect them to make all these heroic calculations in your mind? So they started questioning, and they said, that's not the way people behave. And then they looked at firms, and they said, you know, firms don't necessarily maximize profit. They actually maximize the perks to their managers. And they're not concerned about shareholders like we assume they are. So the behavior of firms, again, was counter to what the body of theory and literature had been saying all along. So over the years, there has developed a body of literature that talks about how people engage, particularly in uncertain environments. What do they do? And then there was there was a series of psychology experiments that said, you know, when people are given a chance to bet on a game, they compute probabilities and they'll bet on the one that has higher expected value. And that was the theory. And then what we discovered through experiments is that people systematically disregard the probabilities and bet very differently from the way we think they do. So a lot of this literature is basically coming out, and it is embedded in looking at the behavior and from that inferring how people think. And so what happened in the area of entrepreneurship is if you looked at the behavior of entrepreneurs, it didn't seem to jive with the way the theory was. And so what we started to think was idiosyncratic behavior was examined more systematically as something that may be more than idiosyncratic. So if you look at where we started here was the popular views of what we consider to be entrepreneurs. And the adjectives that you have heard many, many times in every discussion of entrepreneurship is they're visionary, they're passionate, they have an appetite for risk, they're self-confident, right? They have all those adjectives that you see. The problem I have is I have personal friends who are doctors who have all of those same adjectives that would apply to them. I have lawyer friends for whom all of those adjectives apply. They're decisive, they're determined, they're creative, So it really doesn't tell me much because the same adjectives can apply to successful doctors, to successful lawyers, to successful engineers, to successful managers. So if you think about it for a moment, or even a successful soccer player for that matter, do you think that some of these attributes would not be in Pele, that he became a great player without having some of those same characteristics of being passionate about soccer and being determined and trying again and again? So it doesn't tell us much about entrepreneurs because these are adjectives of any successful individual. That's what they are. But if you look at the literature and you start observing the behavior of serial entrepreneurs, which one of our colleagues at the University of Virginia has done as part of her research, she says, as opposed to big risk takers, entrepreneurs are really do not have a very high appetite for risk. They are actually very adept at what we call de-risking, taking the risk out. So what might appear to us as a very risky thing, what they have done is taken that same opportunity and taken the risk out of it. So the skill is not jumping into a pool before you know how to swim. It is figuring out that since you don't know how to swim, how you're going to negotiate that pool. Big difference in saying they're big risk takers versus very adept at de-risking, very adept at taking out the risk. The other thing we have learned from these is that you don't start with a very well-defined plan. That entrepreneurs don't do that. What they do, like our engineer, is they act. And they throw that can against the tree, and they see if it opens. And if it doesn't open, maybe I'll try a stone in round 2. So you keep changing, you keep adapting, you keep moving. A third thing we have learned, again, because of the action orientation, is entrepreneurs do not spend a lot of time on doing esoteric market research, extrapolations. They would rather go talk to a real customer and find out if there is a market for this. So, and this, by the way, doesn't necessarily apply to the startup of a new business. It could be the startup of a new product, within an existing company. So it's just a matter of how you approach it. Do you want to sit there and do market projections first, or do you want to take some small actions and learn from the experiments? Do you want to put something out there and do it? So a couple of, 2 years ago, we had a similar situation. We have an MBA program. We're located in Boston, and we were thinking about starting an MBA in San Francisco. And of course, our entire graduate school said, let's go out and do a market research study and see if there are some students who will join our program. And I said, well, how much will it cost us? Well, it will cost us $150,000 to do the study. And said, at the end of the study, what do you think we will learn? Or we'll learn that there are some people with an undergraduate degree who might go to Babson. So, well, I know that right now. We know there's a lot of educated people in San Francisco area, but can you tell me if 50 of those will come to Babson? No. So I said, how much will it cost if we just open our doors and see who comes? He said, oh, that's only $50,000. So well, then let's just open it, let's just market it and see who comes. Well, we did 2 months of marketing and we got 35 students. That's enough to get started. Our break even was 20. So again, you notice that it's not just new startups, but in any sphere of life, if you can either spend time on sort of market research, or you can just do it and see what happens. And, if you have the option of doing it, you might as well do it. A lot of myths about creation is that it's original, and it's not really necessarily an original idea that entrepreneurs are working with. They are very good at adapting other people's ideas, putting it together, owning it, shaping it. So a lot of it is in the shaping of things that you and I might consider and we know about, all right? I already talked about the fact that adjectives like self-confident and others, well, applies to a lot of professions. I don't think you can succeed in any chosen profession if you lack self-confidence, so that's not telling us much. Determined, again, an adjective that could apply to a lot of things that you want to do. Unless you are determined to achieve something, you're not likely to achieve it. So it doesn't help us very much there. And same thing, as I said, with decisive. These are egotistical. Well, I think, I'm sure that we all work with a lot of egotistical people in our organization, so it's not essential to be egotistical in order to be a successful entrepreneur. So, as I said, what we are trying to do is to say, when you observe behaviors and actions and results, you need to think about the fact that behind it is a certain pattern of thinking. And that pattern of thinking is something that can be taught, which is why the dominant theme for us at Babson College has always been that this is not something mysterious. It is not something that you are born with. It is something that you can teach, that you can learn, because it is a mode of thought. And that's why what we are basically saying is that if you observe the behaviors of entrepreneurs, you can see that they think differently from other people, but that mode of thinking is something that we all can learn and profit from, and we can learn and profit from them even if we are not engaged in a new business startup. So whether it is me as provost making a decision to open a new section of MBA in San Francisco, or whether it is to start a new business, we can use the same thought process to say, let us act, let us learn from little experiments. So I'm going to stop here and turn it over to Len, and then come back and close up afterward.
Thank you, Kahit. Again, thank you to all of you for being here today, and thank you to Sagia for giving us the opportunity to engage with you about the Babson work on both the methods and practices of entrepreneurs and entrepreneurship, and the extension of the entrepreneurial framework from just an obsessive focus on individuals involved in startup activities to what we call entrepreneurs of all kinds. People who are able to display this entrepreneurial method in a broad variety of contexts and a broad variety of areas. We are explicitly and ideologically actively involved in the broad-scale democratization of entrepreneurship as a method on a global scale. We are actively and ideologically supportive of the broad-scale democratization of entrepreneurship as a method on a global scale, recognizing that entrepreneurship is the most powerful human force for the creation of economic and social value everywhere, and to do anything less than be involved in putting this in as many hands as possible would be a shocking waste of human talent on a global scale. So that's why we spend a lot of time on crafting the method, a lot of time on being able to develop underlying pedagogies to be able to support that method, and then to engage in conferences like this around the world to get individuals like you immersed in understanding that entrepreneurship can and ought to be available to everybody. There are millions, billions of people who have figured out entrepreneurial methods to wake up in the morning and get through the day. And if we spend a fair amount of time trying to study the thought patterns and practices of the billions of people in the world who have nothing in terms of resources to be able to support themselves, we will find an entire stream of necessity-based entrepreneurial activity that looks strikingly like what we're talking about here for successful business people and entrepreneurs. Same basic logic that extends from necessity-based entrepreneurship to social innovation to large enterprise entrepreneuring to actually startup activities. And we'll vary this by context. You had the opportunity over the past couple of days to hear from our colleagues at Babson talking about how we do work in our venture accelerators, and also from Dan Eisenberg to hear about how we think about the development of environments that are conducive to and supportive of the acceleration of startups in a community, how you can actually stimulate bottoms-up entrepreneurial activity, and how you can rigorously measure that and advance that. What we want to be able to do today is identify the underlying logic that drives all of that intervention work. And it all starts with understanding the continuum that we have in the universe, from predictive capability to uncertainty to unknowability. I sat on a panel the other day, and one of the convenient things that goes on when something goes wrong in the world, you can either blame business people or business schools. And since business schools usually don't get to come to defend themselves, they're a much more convenient target. So when I went around the world during the 2008 meltdown and I sat on panels like I sat here, I heard all of the problems in the universe were created by MBAs. And that, in fact, business schools were a scourge on the universe, and that we were teaching people all of the wrong things. I came here 2 days ago and sat on the first panel, and the notion was you can't possibly ever become an entrepreneur by going and wasting time getting an MBA. Well, I'm not suggesting that business schools are the best thing that's happened to the universe. And I'm not suggesting that anybody who gets an MBA is likely to be a successful entrepreneur, but I am suggesting that that's a huge over-attribution of the power that business schools have on the universe. Here's where we stand, okay? And here's, I think, where we are. In the 1950s, business schools, which were still relatively in their infancy, spent a lot of time beginning the process of refining their methodologies and logics. There was nothing called management science. There were no rigorous analytic techniques. There were no sophisticated financial models. And the Ford Foundation produced a multi-million-dollar study in 1957 that talked about the need for the radical redesign of business education in the world. And the evolution of business schools everywhere in the world, Saudi Arabia included, has been focused largely on the continuing implementation of the results that were reached in 1957. They concluded in their report that business schools taught little more than individual manager stories glued together to masquerade as data. Administrative practices masquerading as data, and we needed to make business a science. We needed to ape the physical sciences and we needed to ape the social sciences and recognize all of the rigor we could introduce. I'm here to tell you today that we have carried that task to an illogical extreme. We impose analytical rigor on issues that simply can't be measured. We impose a logic of a precise understanding of the universe that in fact did have a substantial contribution to the economic meltdown. We built sophisticated econometric and financial models that allowed us to delude ourselves, just as Shahid talked about earlier in his economist assumption logic, allowed us to delude ourselves into believing that we understood the way the world worked and that in fact could predict it. But all of those models are largely rooted in an assumption that the future can be linearly extrapolated from the past. And ladies and gentlemen, that is no longer the case. The ability of us to go through our life saying that tomorrow is simply a linear extrapolation from today is sheer folly. And oftentimes we are flying blind. And to over-depend on rigorous analytic techniques that not only purport to predict a future which is unpredictable, but do it by assuming away reality. Because the vast majority of the economic and econometric models assume that human beings are little more than rational economic maximizers. That we can all codify every one of you, your desires, your emotions, and your aspirations with one simple black box. And I believe that everyone in this room would not dignify that with anything other than a giggle. It is just silly. So the assumptions we make to build the sophisticated models are strikingly inappropriate. And the naive assumption that we have that we can predict the future with our models has already been proven to be inappropriate. And to that extent, I do believe that business schools, economists, and sophisticated financial models are engaging in what I affectionately call unproductive stupidity. Engaging in very, very sophisticated analytic techniques for problems that are not appropriate. And then maintaining the illusion that sophisticated mathematical functioning can give us an answer that it can't provide. Why? Because we don't like uncertainty. And we certainly don't like unknowability. Let me give you a very simple example. We'll play a very simple game. I'm going to take an egg. It's just an egg I've taken out of a crate. And I'm going to stretch my arm up as high as I can. And I'm going to stand over a tub of water. When I drop that egg, is it going to break? You don't know. You don't know? Come on. How hard is it to figure that out? It depends. Oh, that's also very useful. So now we have I don't know and it depends. We can build sophisticated financial models to predict the future of the universe, and you can't answer a simple question as to whether this egg will break if I drop it from here. It's not a boiled egg. It's just an egg I've taken out of a little crate. There's no trick. Is there water? There's water in the tub. There's no trick. I'm asking a very simple, straightforward question. Don't assume I'm some magician trying to trick you. How many people believe the egg is going to break? How many people are sure the egg is not going to break? How many people have no idea? How many people don't care? There we go. Okay, so we now have the continuum. So now we understand. The reality is the egg will not break. Right? Now, how would I go about knowing the answer to that question if I was a sophisticated business school analytic? I would understand that there's rigorous physics that's attached to this. I would drive 13 miles down the road from Babson over to MIT. I'd connect with someone in the physics department, and we'd engage in a multi-million-dollar project to engage in sophisticated modeling to understand the fundamental aerodynamics and physics associated with this. My guess is that project would cost several $100,000 and require about 6 months of work. Or I could just drop the egg and see what happens. Right? Well, the reality is many of us operate in our world believing it's better to go down the road and talk to somebody from MIT. Entrepreneurs operate in a world where it's much better to just drop the egg. Let's go out to the beach now. Okay? So we're now here at the sea. I have an egg again. This time I'm going to go into the water and I'm going to throw the egg as high as I can possibly throw, which isn't very high, by the way, but as high as I can possibly throw it, and it's going to hit the water. Is the egg going to break? Yes? How do you know? Huh? Oh, by experience. So you've tried this. Wow, this is the first time I've ever gotten to a group where someone says they've actually gone to the beach and tried this. How many think it will break? Right? Okay, it actually won't. Right? And again, I mean a trivial question, okay? But it is a question that we can get sophisticated analytic techniques to model, or it is a question we can simply experience. We have a bias towards thinking. We have a bias toward analysis. We have a bias towards more rigorous modeling. And increasingly, as the uncertainty in the universe increases, that bias is strikingly unproductive. Let me give you an example. We're saying the context and setting for creation, which is an artificial word I've invented to talk about creation-oriented activity, okay, is all rooted in uncertainty and unknowability. And that, in fact, sometimes, okay, if you don't know what's going on in the universe, sometime we need to come to grips with what rational thinking and behavior looks like in the face of unknowability. And now I'm going to get completely and totally rational. If you sit and think, or do you act? Do you sit and think, or do you act in the face of unknowability? You act, absolutely. Otherwise, why would you be sitting here? You cannot think your way into an unknowable future. Now, we have this marvelous scenario that exists inside most large predictive organizations, right? When somebody fails with a project, what do they usually say about that person? Oh, he just didn't do enough homework to understand everything he needed to understand before he acted. If he had only spent 6 more months studying the question, he might have gotten his arms around every single variable that was necessary to have some measure of control over in order to move forward. And what does that say to everybody else in the organization? Don't act. The smartest thing to do is put your head down and study things some more. But in reality, studying things some more in the context of uncertainty, the fun of unknowability, is completely useless. The only logical thing to do is act. And that what we've discovered by examining a portfolio of successful serial entrepreneurs across a broad array of organizations, there are smart ways to act. It's one of the nice things about being a professor at a university. We can actually talk about the difference between smart action and dumb action. Right? There are lots of places you can go to learn dumb action. We go to Babson to learn how to act smartly. 1, you take small steps with what you've got at hand. What do you learn usually when you go to business school and they're telling you about starting a new venture? They say, get clear, and we heard it about my panel a couple days ago. Get clear on this big, expansive vision. Be very clear about the goals you're trying to achieve. Develop a rigorous business plan outlining all the resource requirements you have, both in terms of financial resources and in terms of human resources. And by that time, you're sufficiently tired, okay, that you've discovered that you've gotten so completely invested in this business planning process, you've lost sight of what your idea is, and you're so immersed in trying to accumulate resources, you've effectively forgotten how to take action. We have countless number of entrepreneurship programs that make that mistake. An entrepreneurship program at the vast majority of business schools and universities in the world, when we have a starting new ventures course, what do? They tell people to take big steps and outline a huge business plan. We've invented at our institution virtually every pedagogical innovation in entrepreneurship. We invented the first business plan competition for entrepreneurship programs back in 1979. We've been doing this for a long time. Last year, we abandoned business planning competitions for entrepreneurs. Because what we've discovered is it generates an unusually high level of commitment to seriously stupid ideas. And people get so invested in the doing of the doing and the construction of the plan and the articulation of big steps that they forget about who they are, what they know, who they know, what they have in their network and what they have in their body, and how they can just get started. How they can simply take action in the face of uncertainty to just get started. I just finished a book that's coming out next month, and working very hard around all of these concepts. And we struggled with the issue of what are we going to call it so it seems incredibly sophisticated. And we finally decided that we would succumb to the truth. So it's called Just Start. Right? When you're confronting uncertainty, just start. Take small steps with what you've got at hand. Focus on your means, not on the ends. Limit the risk for each step. Again, on the podium the other day, and what you hear from the legendary stories of entrepreneurs, they're aggressively outstanding risk takers. They're able to determine risk, assess risk, they're able to take big risks, and they're able to live to tell the story about how you can take big risks. The smart serial entrepreneurs we engage with don't take much in the way of risks. They really have figured out for each step of the process, once they get started, how they can minimize the risks they take, how they can syndicate the risks they take, in fact, how they can drive risks to almost zero. And there's a methodology and a technique that they use to be able to do that we'll see today. They make sure that they're stepping on firm ground, reality. They're not dealing with the emotionality of a 45-page business plan. They're dealing with the reality of having taken a step, figuring out where they are, and once they've taken a step and figuring out where they are, figuring out where to go next. Very grounded, very practical, very concrete. They build off what you actually find, whether it be good or bad. On Saturday, we had the opportunity to interact with the Saudi Fast Growth 100, and I talked about a visit I made with a collection of Saudi businessmen several years ago, where at dinner, I wanted to explore the concept of failure in entrepreneurship in the kingdom. And these were all large enterprise business executives, and they were universal in an instant response to me. Failure? We know exactly how you deal with failure. Go to the desert and don't come back. Right? And I sat there and I said, oh, this is a sign of encouragement. Okay? This is going to be a great way to build a robust entrepreneurial ecosystem. Now, this concept of failure, okay, is a very, very difficult construct to get our arms around. In the West, we've actually done an analysis in the United States of the systematic ability in the literature in the United States to separate personal failure from venture failure. And it turns out until about 100 years ago, when they talked about individuals, they were able to say, he failed at this venture, but it doesn't mean anything about him. Now what we have here and in the United States is an increasing obsession about commingling personal failure with venture failure and having people walk away assuming that both are inextricably intertwined. And we have to change that. Now, a lot of the literature now is writing about celebrating failure. And I get a fair amount of time to go around the world talking about this, and I don't get very positive reactions when I say we need to shift our culture to celebrate failure. People just don't say, yeah, that's a great idea, right? In fact, I made a huge mistake my first year as a college president, speaking, and we're a tuition-dependent institution. So I was speaking to a group of the parents of students who'd been applying to the school and who'd been accepted, talking about Babson and the Babson difference. And I stood up and said, it's really important to understand what's fundamentally different about the institution you are considering for your son or daughter. This institution has failure written all over it. You come to Babson, you will fail fast, you will fail often. In fact, the entire first year of the school, where you start your own venture, enables you to fail at least once a week, publicly, and celebrate it. And for that, we will charge you $54,000 a year for room and board. That's right. The notion that somebody could say something that's stupid and gets applause, right? It wasn't a great admissions year. Next year I got up, and the admissions people said, please don't give the same speech you gave last year. Please. Okay? So I stood up and gave a very different speech. I talked about acting, learning from your action, and building on what you learned. Acting, learning from your action, and building on what you've learned. Because action is the only way by which we can create the hypotheses and the evidence that are necessary for the scientific method that we all love to work. In an environment of extreme uncertainty, action is the only mechanism to create the evidence that allows us to generate hypotheses, to use science and the scientific method. And the notion that we can, in fact, learn from our actions and then figure out what the next step is to take is the essence of the entrepreneur's life. Take a step, see where you are, and decide not what you're going to do, but decide what you're going to do next. I am naturally suspicious of much of the presentations and much of the literature that talks about the importance of starting with an incredible vision of what it is you're trying to do. Because the vast majority of the successful serial entrepreneurs we've studied and we've spent time with had a vague notion and enough of a notion to stimulate their desire and did not really learn in detail what they were trying to do until they'd taken several steps and reality emerged. The literature is incredibly supportive of that notion going back 40 years, where Henry Mintzberg, in the context of the nature of managerial work, talked about the notion of strategy as an emergent process, not as a planned process. And that in an uncertain environment like the one we play in and the ones in which entrepreneurs play, those notions of vision, those notions of direction, those notions of what end lines look like come out as much from what happened with this step as it comes from sitting in a room trying to plan about a future that you don't know anything about in the first place. And then it's nice to have some friends or resources standing by to help or rescue. So let me tell you a story about the myth versus the reality of entrepreneurship. And since I know there's a store right out here, you all have some familiarity with it. It's Starbucks. Everybody here has probably had the opportunity to read at least of one of Howard Schultz's 3 autobiographies. 57 years old and has already written 3 autobiographies. That's 1 autobiography for every 19 years of his life. Now, how many of you have done enough things in your life to write 3 autobiographies? Actually, what you need to do is you have to have enough success to hire 3 ghostwriters. Because he had 3 ghostwriters, it doesn't much matter that the stories don't overlap. So he's actually rewritten his life several times over the 57 years. If you read the first volume, the first autobiography, which is affectionately called How I Created It, the second one is called How They Screwed It Up. The third one is How I Came Back and Fixed It. Okay, but if you read the first one, you hear this story about this poor guy from New York who was selling kitchen supplies out on the West Coast and had a vision. Had a vision that was rooted in a trip he took to Italy, standing out on the piazza of an Italian community and discovering how wonderful it would be for Americans to be able to embrace the authentic Italian espresso bar experience. And that he came back to the United States and built Starbucks. Here's the reality. Reality is he did go to Italy, he came back with a plan. Came back with a very detailed plan to create an authentic coffee bar experience. And none of the data in the plan was remotely supportive of this idea. For 20 years before he started what became Starbucks, coffee was, declines in market share and coffee were being experienced in the United States. The year that Starbucks was actually created, caffeinated beverages in terms of colas exceeded the source of caffeination of choice for most young people. So Pepsi-Cola and Coca-Cola exceeded coffee as the source of caffeination. 20 straight years of decline and cola beverages beating out coffee beverages. Does this sound like an environment where the data is incredibly supportive of an entrepreneurial venture? No. So he went to see 252 people with this plan. And what did they say? These are very sophisticated, data-oriented, analytic people, like bankers, who know all things in the universe, or at least purport to have models that enable them to know all things in the universe. And they said market share declines, obviously. Source of caffeination declines, obviously. This is a dumb idea. He couldn't get through to see any financial support. He got to some family, he got to some friends. 17 people out of 252 people gave him some access to financial resources. Not anywhere near what he was looking for. So he went out into the market to start this coffee bar with less than 20% of the money that he thought he needed in order to create a new experience. And he created not Starbucks, but Il Giornale. I'm sure all of you remember this, right? You can't. You have to have been there because it's not in the book. Il Giornale, the authentic coffee bar experience. Il Giornale had continuous, non-stop opera music from the moment it opened to the moment it closed. Non-stop opera music. Now, for some of you, that might be enjoyable, okay? And it certainly is authentic, right? The entire menu was written in Italian. The entire menu. And the baristas all wore tuxedo shirts and vests. Oh, yes, because he didn't have enough money, and it was a very small space, there was no place to sit. It was going to be a stand-up coffee bar. He opens up Il Giornale, very excited. In the first 5 days at Il Giornale, he had 1,465 customers. Virtually every one of them hated the experience and swore they'd never come back again. So how do you get from 1,465 ticked off customers to Starbucks? Well, he had some friends and resources standing by to help or rescue. He had what Paul Pullman talked about in his presentation this morning. He had explicit recognition and understanding that consumers/customers have the answers to much of your problems. He interviewed the vast majority of these disaffected customers as they left, and they told him what was wrong. You know what they told him? I hate opera music. Why is this menu all in Italian? And the baristas, whose uniform was ruined 4 minutes into the day, said, oh, this is just awful. So the staff hated it. The customers hated it. Nothing was working. And from interactions with 1,465 ticked-off customers and a collection of staff, he was able to engage in the co-creation that built Starbucks. Starbucks was manufactured from the interactions with 1,465 disaffected customers and associated staff. Starbucks didn't come from a business plan. Starbucks came from what we used to call a failure, but we now call an opportunity to act, learn, and build, and to interact with stakeholders who are involved in that process to help you to do that. Now, the other question we keep having here is this notion about where opportunity exists and where entrepreneurs play. Now, we call this presentation How to Find and Make Opportunities to Create Economic and Social Value. And by the way, we are here from a business school, so you can't have a business school-oriented presentation without the obligatory 2x2 matrix. So here we go. Here's the 2x2 matrix. And the question is, where do these entrepreneurs like to play, since you all know about entrepreneurs? We have existing product in existing market, existing product in a new product in an existing market, and a new product in a new market, right? That's the continuum. So where do you think entrepreneurs like to play? Anybody? New market, what? New market, new product? Who said that? New market, new product. Are you crazy? So you're saying in the lower right, why would entrepreneurs like to play where they know nothing about the product and nothing about the market? Vision. Ah, vision. There we go. Those are the mythological stories from which greatness is built. Right? We know nothing about what we're selling, we're making, and we know nothing about who we're selling it to, but we have a dream. Right? We have a dream. Well, let's look at the more boring forms before we get to where you are. Existing products and existing markets. Entrepreneurs love to play in that space, where you take an existing product, an existing market, you manage things incrementally better, and you make tons of money just by doing it better. Entrepreneurs are great at finding forces where products and services interact with consumers and their opportunities to streamline, improve delivery. The vast majority of entrepreneurial innovations in small enterprises in the world is concentrated in this space of simply doing things better. We can bring new products to existing markets. That obviously gives us the capacity to extend our reach within an existing market. And the large CPG companies in the world that are represented in this forum have built their entire growth strategies on reformatting, repackaging, and adapting their existing products and services for the 6 billion people at the bottom of the pyramid who heretofore have been excluded from consumer transactions. So we have adaptation and extension presenting huge opportunities for entrepreneurs. Now, we're getting to where you want to play, where we have vision. First, I'm going to tell you what they call that box in business school, and then we'll talk about what entrepreneurs do in it. In business school, that's called the suicide quadrant. Why would you ever want to fly blind when you can have information? Right? So why would you ever want to fly blind when you could actually know something? And it turns out because there's something that's wonderful about entrepreneurs and wonderful about entrepreneurship that defies the rules of economics. If you go to classic Schumpeterian economics, since many of the economic definitions of entrepreneurship have their roots in Joseph Schumpeter, it articulates entrepreneurship as serving at the intersection of disruption in market forces that present themselves with opportunities. Nowhere in the economic literature, nowhere in Schumpeterian economics, is there any acknowledgement of the fact that human beings have the capacity to create something. Nowhere is there explicit recognition that entrepreneurship is the most optimistic science of human potential ever documented, because it explicitly recognizes, along with our ability to deal at the intersection of disruptive market forces, human beings uniquely have the capacity to create something from nothing, to actually create an entity, to create a product, to create a service, to create an enterprise that wasn't here yesterday. That's what excites us about entrepreneurship, that we can do all of this work. Now, the vast majority of the schools in the world are very good at using deep analytic techniques to help us find opportunities at the intersection of market forces. Virtually none of them spend any time at all teaching people how to make opportunities. Virtually none of them. Because it's not in the literature. Because it's not in the assumptive set of economics. And because it requires a set of assumptions about human potential that by and large don't exist in the literature. It also turns out from our perspective that the successful serial entrepreneurs are quite unusual in their comfort and preference to play in a space where there's high degrees of uncertainty and unknowability. But not because they have a grand vision. Not because they have a grand vision, but because in fact they know how to master this basic technique of entrepreneurial thought and action to create a logic of creating. And what does it start with? Again, the other day, if you were here in the opening session, we had this debate and discussion about whether entrepreneurs are passionate. And a number of us just reviled at that notion. Because passion is a very loaded word. The word I use is desire. Desire is substantially less loaded than passion, substantially more impactful than motivation. Desire fuels action in entrepreneurs. Why do I say that? Because entrepreneurs are always doing what they want or something that will get them what they want. So rule number one, entrepreneurs are always doing what they want or something that will get them what they want, because in the face of the unknown, it makes no sense to act unless you want to. I mean, this is not very complex, okay? In the face of the unknown, it makes no sense to act unless you want to, whether you have to or not. So we need to start our framework not with market forces, not with complex environmental analyses, but a basic assessment of who you are, who you know, and what you want. By the way, most business school curricula don't focus on that at all. For anybody here who has a graduate business degree, did you ever have a course on who are you? Did you ever have an inventory on who you know? Did you ever get through a systematic process of assessing your means? Did anybody ever ask you, what do you want? No, because if you master education, particularly traditional liberal arts and professional education that's rooted in the scientific method, it's not about who you are and what you want. It's about your ability to master the recitation of answers to questions that are already known. Your ability to master the recitation of answers to questions that have already been answered by others. What we're trying to do is build an institution that allows you to be stupid productively, that allows you to be ignorant proudly. And instead of spending your time answering questions that are already known, we're suggesting that you go out and engage in learning about things that we don't know by taking action, by taking steps. And there's going to be a much higher probability that significant discoveries are going to be born of that action than are going to be born of continuing to focus on answering questions that we've already answered. And we're going to satisfy instead of optimize. Herb Salmon, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, recognized in The Science of the Artificial that the concept of optimization, as attractive as it might be for engineers and scientists and mathematicians, has no role to play in an assessment of the human condition. That human beings don't optimize because they don't live in environments loaded with perfect information. Human beings satisfice. In a predictable environment, optimization might be possible, but in an unknowable environment, optimization is fundamentally impossible. So, big idea, satisfice, wins a Nobel Prize. What does it mean? You take desire plus what's good enough at a point in time, and you go with it. Right? What do you want, and what's good enough at a point in time to go with it? An amazing construct that recognizes the complexity of human beings. So, quickly as we go through this, what is entrepreneurial thought in action? It's a method that comprises two logics. First logic, that which we all know, that which we've all been trained in, that which we've all been educated in, that which we can all have mastery of. Tried and true tools and techniques of optimization, linear programming, mathematical programming, financial modeling. I'm going to give you a wonderful example of carrying this to its logical, illogical extreme. How many bankers do I have in the room? Yeah, they won't raise their hand now. It's amazing. They were all bankers yesterday. How do bankers assess the quality of an idea? Expected return, right? They have rigorous measures of expected return. So how do you adjust for uncertainty when you're calculating expected return? Two ways, right? One is you ask for additional data. So you say the 40 pages of PowerPoint presentations are not enough. Give me another 80, right? Or you do risk-adjusted betas, or some combination. When the idea approaches unknowability, at what point in the process does somebody raise their hand and say, the analytic techniques are useless? Right? And we're going to show you how entrepreneurs have turned that completely on its head and have moved completely away from expected value as a vehicle for organizing their work. Because, again, it's exceeded the natural utility when we move beyond the world of the known. And we take swift and confident and smart action when faced with the unknown. So, the predictive model we all know. Inductive and deductive logic, rooted largely in math, rules of thumb. It's the core logic of every basic school. It's the core logic of every basic large organization. And it works superbly well to the extent that the future can be divined or extrapolated from the past. His Highness Al-Faisal this morning talked about Western versus Islamic finance and made some reasonably provocative comments that I've heard several times before being out here, but really did focus on the fact that there's a basic set of assumptions embedded in the mathematical logic of Western finance that says that the future can be divined or extrapolated from the past. We have a large consumer finance franchise in the United States that has people making investments based on television advertising. Right? That you will have a mutual fund that will advertise on television, and we have an independent ranking service that will assign stars to a mutual fund, 1 through 5 stars based on desirability, although you only see 5-star mutual funds advertised. Why would someone advertise a 1-star mutual fund? It just says our fund stinks, buy it. So they're all 5-star funds on television. At the end of the ad for the 5-star mutual fund, there's a caveat at the bottom. You know what the caveat is? Warning, future performance cannot be extrapolated from the past performance of this fund. And what do people do? They buy it. Why? Because they'd like to believe that future performance can be extrapolated from the past. And when it doesn't, what happens? They get upset. I got cheated. No, you didn't get cheated. You were naive and stupid. You didn't get cheated. We told you in the ad. But you gave it 5 stars. But we told you don't rely on the 5 stars. What do the entrepreneurs do? Turns out 89% of the time they prefer not to live in that world of Morningstar 5 stars. They use action, they take smart action, and they test their hypotheses by taking steps rather than relying on all the analytic tools of traditional business. I'll press the button again, we'll see what happens. Ready? Let's sing. 1, 2, 3. Try it again. 1, 2, 3. There, thank you. It favors what's real and confirmable over projections and assumptions because you've taken a step. In other words, what we're saying is smart action trumps analysis. Smart action trumps analysis. Drop the egg if you want to know what happens. Don't go to MIT. Really very simple. And it is the suitable technique when the future can't be predicted from the past. And in extreme uncertainty, it's the only logical choice. It's the preferred choice in many situations of uncertainty. In extreme uncertainty, it's the only logical choice you have. So, activity for the entrepreneur is driven by desire. How does one figure out what they want? How does one figure out what they truly desire? Well, for some of you, it just might be an intriguing area. For some of you, it just might be, oh my Lord, these are 2 people I'd like to work with. We studied the evolution of 50 entrepreneurial partnerships several years ago. And what we discovered is in 42 of the 50 entrepreneurial partnerships, they started with, you know what? We like each other. It might be fun to do something. Absolutely no idea of a business. Absolutely no idea of a venture. Just simply interpersonal attraction and a desire to do something together. Others of you have a psychological profile that basically requires you to have deep analytics before you can decide what you want. Right? So we just simply need to recognize that each of us are different, and desire is stimulated for us in a variety of different ways. But it all starts with desire. What is the sufficient desire to get started? We need enough motivation, we need enough desire to take that first step, to just start. What does it take to get you to just start? And once you've started, how do you do it? 1, act quickly with your means at hand. We've already seen that story before. It's with what you have, who you are, what you know, what resources you have at your disposal, not what plan you're trying to build about the future. This one, by the way, if you take away nothing from this entire conference other than this idea, I guarantee you this will be worth the price of admission. Entrepreneurs don't use expected return. They don't go into ventures with a clear articulation of what the hurdle rates are going to be, what the 5-year expected return is going to be, how this venture is going to be harvested, at what multiple of cash flow, with what size of employee population. What they say is, I like this idea and I'd like to take a first step. And then they decide, given the fact that I'd like to take the first step, how much am I willing to pay to play? It's about affordable loss, not about expected return. You have money at your disposal, you have time at your disposal, you have reputation at your disposal, you have psychosocial relationships at your disposal. What are you willing to risk to go into a venture? And we encourage you to use a tool of decision science known as pre-mortems. All of you know about post-mortems. Post-mortems are, the project is over, let's figure out what we did, how we screwed up, and how we do better next time. Now we're going to go with a pre-mortem. A pre-mortem is to imagine the worst possible outcome associated with your actions. to fantasize about the worst thing that can happen, and to decide whether you're willing to engage in it despite that. To decide that I'm going to spend the equivalent of 10 million real to go into a venture, and if I lost that, it would be fine. To decide I'm going to spend 6 months to connect up to a venture, right? And that if I lost the 6 months, it would be fine. We found several years ago when I first got to Babson that in our incubator at the time, 75% of the businesses that were being incubated were Web 2.0 internet-based businesses. The most interesting thing about that in 2008 when we conducted that analysis is Babson College had no courses in Web 2.0. 75% of the businesses that were getting incubated had no relationship to anything we were teaching from a content perspective. Why? They saw the web was cheap to get into. Didn't require a lot of financial resources. By the way, it was the worst environment for college undergraduates to find jobs with large companies. So they had opportunity cost was lessened, and they had time on their hands. It's easy to understand how lots of young people gravitated to the web if you think about it in terms of affordable loss. Oh, by the way, here's the coolest thing about affordable loss. If you've done your pre-mortem, if you've decided what you're willing to spend to take the first step in a venture, right, the plunge decision, you've decided that and you've brought closure to that on the pre-mortem, risk and uncertainty disappear. Right? You've already fantasized about the worst possible outcome and decided that you're willing to play. Traditional notions of risk and uncertainty have disappeared. It is absolutely amazing how we engage with entrepreneurs and they tell us about the logic that underlies their plunge decision, and they in no way believe they're taking a risk. In no way. The literature told by successful entrepreneurs to ghostwriters is all about risk. The reality of their psychological endeavors and their steps wipes risk out. They bring others along. Two constituencies. Customers, just the same way that Howard Schultz created Starbucks out of the co-creation interaction with 1,465 unsatisfied customers, or they bring others along through enrollment. They get others engaged through their motivation, through their personality, through the dynamics of their idea to actually become advocates and ambassadors for the idea. And then they act. And then what happens? Something happens. They take a step and something happens. What do they do with what they have? Well, they take a step, they see what's happened, they discover something, and they recognize, yeah, we can call it failure, we can call it act, learn, build, but oftentimes there are surprises. And surprises are often good. And they befriend reality rather than be afraid of it. And then the next question they ask is, what do you do next? Not what do you do? Several years ago, in the process of building this framework, I had a faculty member who's an anthropologist at Babson College who saw this and said, that's exactly what I ask my students. I tell them, stop worrying about what they're going to do and start worrying about what they're going to do next. And I said, oh, that's great. Figuring that she had a rigorous empirical justification for this perspective. So I said, so where did you read this? Where did it come from? She said, my mother told it to me. I'm still completely sucked into the conversation. And I say, well, thinking that her mother must be an academic and has deep academic underpinnings where this came from. I said, so can I talk to your mother? Where did she get it from? She goes, my mother is a yoga instructor. And so I talked to her. And it turns out this principle of what do you do next is a fundamental organizing principle of Iyengar yoga in the Indian tradition. Basically saying if you're going into your yoga poses, the worst possible thing to do is to focus on where you're going to end up. Because it can assure you that if you focus on where you're going to end up when you should be focusing on the next step, you're going to fall flat on your rear end and you're going to hurt yourself. If you focus on the end point instead of focusing on what you're going to do next, you're going to fall down and you're going to hurt yourself. And that's a certainty. On the other hand, we rigorously get ourselves in the pose, we assess current reality, and we figure out what the next step is in the process. And we keep ourselves grounded entirely through that process. And then we go back to reassessing where we are. So there's a continuous act, learn, build cycle that we're going through. So what have we done? We act quickly with the means at hand. We pay only what you can afford to and want to. We bring others along, and we build on the results you create and the things you discover. It's just that simple. And so we're going to go through this very quickly. You've had this already. I've told you all these. Can you go back? No, keep going. There we go. There. You've acted. Now we take stock of the new current reality. As we said, the last step either turned out the way you hoped, in which case celebrate your success and get started on the next. Or it didn't. So what's our new concept of failure? Instead of saying you failed, we said, quite likely, you've just learned something that perhaps nobody else knows. Now, doesn't that sound so much better than you failed, go to the desert, and don't come back? Now we're saying, quite likely, you've just learned something that perhaps nobody else knows. We've entirely reframed the language to begin to develop a level of support and a level of acceptability for that which another language and another set of words we've defined as being completely unacceptable. So befriend reality or you're going to miss something important. A surprise can point to new opportunities. A surprise can be a problem. Solve it if you can. Your solution is likely to become your asset. And if you can't solve the problem, get creative. Assume it will perpetually exist and you can't eliminate it. Then try to turn it into an asset. So here I'm going to show you a little picture that brings this to closure. Let me talk about the world that most of us are used to and what achievement looks like in that world. So there you are at the bottom of this drawing, okay? That's your starting. And we focused on an ambitious goal, okay? So we're obsessed about goals. We're not obsessed about current reality. And in a predictive world, what do? By the way, this happens to be a Six Sigma organization. So anytime we get the slightest deviation from the plan, what do? Get back on the plan. The plan is sacred. Don't deviate from the plan. Or we have this model. Stay on target. No matter where you are, don't lose sight that it's 22% earnings by March 30th. Right? Don't lose sight of that. This morning in Paul Pullman's comments, he talked about an explicit decision inside the Unilever organization to divorce itself from quarterly earnings reporting to the investment community and to run an organization that's more focused on the long term, to deviate from the standard predictive model that exemplifies the large public corporation in the world. Now let's look at the entrepreneurs. So they've gone out, they've deviated, they found another way to get to the goal. They've taken a step, however, now, and this other goal looks more intriguing. There's something else out there. Oh, they've now picked up a friend. And with the friend, they've reshaped the opportunity, and they're looking at something else. And now 3 folks have gone and found an entirely different place from where they started. They look completely different because they are completely different. They are intellectual and practical and philosophical extremes. But we need both in order to function. Entrepreneurs need predictive logics in environments where there is prediction to be done. And predictive managers need entrepreneurs to help them to see things that can't be derived empirically from a reality that you can't understand. We need to be effortlessly bilingual. Effortlessly bilingual. Does anybody know the research on how one develops the capacity to be effortlessly bilingual? The most powerful way? First of all, learn the language at a much earlier age than we do. The older you are, the harder it is to become bilingual. But if you get to be my age, the easiest way to become effortlessly bilingual is to fall in love with a person who doesn't speak your language. And then figure it out. Now, see how different they are when you encounter an impenetrable obstacle. So in the first one, they go and hit a wall, and what happens? They fall down. In the second one, they hit a wall, and what happens? They start going off to a different goal. Completely different logic in a completely different place. Finally, when to stop? And the answer is, since this says I'm 1 minute and 45 minutes over, I'm going to stop soon. It turns out that entrepreneurs tend to have this predisposition to get attached to their ideas because, as we heard in the other sessions, they're passionate about them. But they're really not. When do you stop? Continue until you don't want to do something anymore. The easiest way to figure out when to stop is when you don't want it. The second easiest way is when you've exceeded your affordable loss. You've done your pre-mortem and it's gone further than you want. The third piece is that you've proven to yourself that it can't be done. So whether it be a view of the future or a basement for commitment and actions, what we've been able to articulate here and what we've been able to build a framework for you on, and hopefully what we'll be able to engage with you on through the rest of this conference, is the explicit recognition that alongside all of the predictive business school-oriented logics in the world that we all believe in, okay, we have an explicit need for an alternative set of frameworks and logics that have been taught to us by successful serial entrepreneurs who develop the mechanism and capacity to act in the face of extreme levels of uncertainty. And that presents us all an opportunity to become effortlessly bilingual by understanding and continue to master all of the tools and techniques of deep analytics, but to also be incredibly respectful of their limitations. But most importantly, to recognize one of the most powerful things about entrepreneurship that says it is the most optimistic logic, human logic, because it recognizes not only the capacity of human beings to find opportunities at the intersection of market forces, but to actually create something in the suicide quadrant, where we know nothing about the product and nothing about the customer, to create something today that didn't exist yesterday. It's our ability to find and make opportunities that makes entrepreneurship so incredibly important and so incredibly powerful, and makes all of us at Babson both practically and ideologically supportive of making sure that these ideas and these techniques get to as many hands and as many heads to stimulate as much action in the world as is physically possible. It has an explicit connection to well-being in all societies and is the most powerful source for economic and social value creation we have. Thank you so much for your time and attention.